The first thing I noticed was the perfume, not the kind you wear to work or to church, but the kind that leaves a room before you do and lingers on a man's lapel like a rumor. It hit me when I reached to straighten Mark's tie in the hotel lobby. A warm, bittersweet note I didn't own gliding over the starched collar I'd ironed that afternoon. He laughed a little too easily and brushed my hand away, watching the elevator numbers climb as if the doors might open onto a better version of us. A mirror across the marble floor caught our reflection. My lipstick smudged from the drive his smile held in place, like a pin in a corsage. Somewhere above us, a ballroom buzzed with applause, a fundraiser he'd promised we would slip in and out of just FaceTime. He'd said no speeches, no fuss. I followed him into the glitter, the perfume curling after us like a ribbon I couldn't untie. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and if stories about dignity coming home to roost keep you company the way they do for me, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the moment the truth finally breathes. My name is Elena, and I have spent most of my adult life teaching teenagers how to choose their words before their words choose them. In the hallways of the high school, I move like a traffic light, slow them down, wave them through, keep them safe. While at home, I've tried to keep the same rhythm: dinner at 6, homework at the kitchen table, quiet after 10. I grew up in a house where you saved the good plates for company and never aired your business on the porch, where my mother folded grief into the laundry and my father believed in doors that shut softly. Mark's family was louder, proud men who built things with their hands and kept score without calling it that quick to clap your back and quicker to tell you how to fix what wasn't broken. When we married, I thought our differences made a whole, my caution, his appetite like threads in a rope meant to hold. We bought the brick colonial on Sycamore Lane with a yard that modestly promised spring, and for a long time, it kept its word. Lily learned to ride her bike between the mailboxes. Walter taught her to steady herself by looking where she wanted to go, not at the cracks in the asphalt. On Fridays, Mark grilled, even if the air bit our fingers, swearing smoke made the cold honest. And I let him believe it because I loved the way his stories made Lily laugh. We were sturdy from the street, tidy from the sidewalk, the kind of family you can sketch in one line without lifting your pencil. There were years when that would have been enough, and I thought we were still living in them. Tessa moved back to town, around then the friend who knew my maiden name and how I wore my hair in college when it rained. She built a business dressing rooms for other people's big moments, turning empty ballrooms into photographs you could stand inside, and she came over one afternoon with swatches fanned like playing cards. "Let me give you a real anniversary," she said, tapping our table with a manicured nail. "No paper plates, promise." It felt like kindness, and I took it that way because I wanted to. The first time I saw her teasing Mark about his too serious shoes, I smiled and poured more iced tea, chalking it up to the old ease that follows you like a shadow when you've shared years and rough couches. When she hugged me goodbye, her perfume stayed on the air, pretty and insistent. And I told myself the house was simply catching up to her. Mark's job kept him in airports and conference rooms with no windows where success is measured in head counts and handshakes. He liked making numbers behave, and he liked being the one who could push them into place, a man built for charts and wide gestures. I stayed anchored to school bells and report cards, to the gentle shock of a kid finally telling the truth, to the art of listening without turning it into a mirror. At dinner, he told stories about impossible clients and the tricks that made them possible. I told stories about quiet victories and the way a single apology can rake the gravel from a child's throat. We were different stages in the same play, and most nights the applause felt real enough. But the easy parts started to require explanation. Mark's shirts came home pressed, but not familiar. His excuses dressed in better words than mine, and some nights he carried his phone like a passport, guarding it with a smile that didn't ask to be believed. Tessa called more often with favors that sounded like gifts, asking if I could review a scholarship application for a boy whose mother cleaned the venue, or if Lily could babysit a client's little girls at half her usual rate because there would be cake. I said yes, because that's what decent people do, and because kindness had always been my currency. I didn't feel poor, yet just careful. On the night of the fundraiser, the ballroom at the Riverton Club drowned in light, the kind that pretends it knows you. Tessa floated toward us in a dress that looked like it had been sewn right onto her, kissed the air near my cheek, and slid a hand through Mark's elbow as if she were directing traffic. "You clean up beautifully," she said to both of us, but the compliment settled in only one place. The band picked up something smooth and exonerating, and when Mark leaned close to tell me he'd only be a minute, the perfume on his collar answered for him, spelling out a name I wasn't ready to read. I watched them cross the floor together. Two people who knew where the cameras were, and for the first time in a long while, I let the question form without smothering it. When did I start asking permission to be suspicious? The waiter set a glass of champagne at my elbow. I don't remember ordering, and across the room a photographer lifted his lens like a blessing. Mark turned at the flash, his mouth open in a laugh I hadn't heard at home in months, and Tessa's hand tightened at his sleeve as if she owned the next moment and the ones after it. The music swelled, the room approved, and my phone buzzed on the table with a single message that made the lights tilt just a preview. A handful of words from an unknown number paired with a photo I couldn't ignore. I picked it up, felt the room fold in around me, and realized the perfume was no longer a rumor. The phone buzzed in my hand until the screen dimmed, but I couldn't take my eyes off the photograph. Mark stood too close to Tessa in the lobby bar, his hand brushing her sleeve as if it had every right to rest there. The angle wasn't sharp, more candid than posed, but it carried the kind of truth 1,000 explanations can't wash away. Behind them, a cluster of guests raised glasses in toast, and their laughter blurred into a halo framing the two of them like conspirators who believed the crowd would never notice. I slipped the phone into my clutch and lifted the champagne glass the waiter had left for me, though the bubbles tasted flat, all promise, and no spark. I made myself walk across the room steady steps that betrayed nothing, as if my legs had rehearsed the moment before my heart ever understood it. Mark spotted me first, his expression flickering the kind of hesitation that lasts only a second, but writes its own confession. Tessa turned slowly, her smile a fraction too quick. The perfume I'd first caught on his collar, now drifting between us like proof with no need of words. "Elena, you made it," she said brightly, though her hand lingered on his arm, a beat too long before she let go. My husband adjusted his tie, as if the room had simply grown warmer, but his gaze avoided mine, skipping across the crowd in search of distraction. The rest of the evening blurred into background noise, the speeches, the clinking of silverware, the music stitched too perfectly to be real. I smiled when I had to, nodded when addressed, but beneath the veneer, my chest tightened with each glance exchanged across the table. It wasn't just the perfume or the photo. It was the way their laughter bent toward each other, the way they seemed to breathe in rhythm, oblivious to the space I occupied between them. I told myself to wait to watch, because rushing into words too soon could cost me more than silence ever would. That night at home, the house carried a strange stillness. Lily had gone to bed early, books scattered across her desk, the quiet hum of her music seeping under the door. Mark moved through the kitchen with the detachment of a man who had already traveled elsewhere in his mind, setting his glass in the sink without rinsing it, loosening his tie, as though it were the evening alone that had suffocated him. Long night, he said, his voice practiced the kind meant to close doors rather than open them. I nodded, my hands folded over the clutch, still hidden under my arm, the photo inside a weight heavier than its size. He kissed my forehead, briefly distracted, and disappeared upstairs, leaving me with the echo of his footsteps and the faint scent of cologne that no longer belonged to me. I stayed at the kitchen table long after the refrigerator's hum was the only sound. My eyes kept returning to the memory of Tessa's hand on his arm, casual, yet claiming her smile curved toward him, as if she'd rehearsed it in the mirror. She had always been the kind of woman who filled a room confident enough to pull attention without asking for it. But that night, she hadn't just taken space, she had taken him. My chest burned with the thought, but beneath the sting, a quieter ache stirred the kind that whispers long before you admit its truth. Something had shifted, and I couldn't push it back into place. The first real fracture came 2 mornings later. Mark left for work early, saying he had a breakfast meeting across town. His words rushed as he kissed my cheek with coffee still on his breath. The garage door rattled shut behind him, and for a moment, I almost believed him, almost convinced myself that suspicion was just a shadow stretching too far. But when I went to straighten the coat closet later that afternoon, a detail pricked me. His navy suit jacket, the one he had laid out the night before, was still hanging on its hook, untouched. Instead, the gray one he rarely wore was missing, along with the tie Tessa had given him last Christmas wrapped in paper so thick, I'd wondered if she was hiding more than fabric inside. I held the empty hanger in my hand, the metal cool against my skin, and realized the cracks weren't imagined. They were real, spreading quietly through the life I thought was still whole. Evenings turned stranger after that. He would claim late calls with clients or dinners that stretched past reason, and though his explanations were smooth, they never landed clean. He texted less, laughed less, and the warmth I used to feel in his presence seemed to slip into other rooms where I no longer had the key. I watched him from across the couch, his eyes lit by his phone instead of me, and the silence between us grew thicker, crowded with all the words neither of us spoke. He wasn't cruel, not yet, but he had become something harder and different, detached, already rehearsing a life in which I was a supporting role at best. Lily noticed in her own way, though she never said it outright. One evening, she lingered in the kitchen, her eyes following him as he left for another client dinner. She waited until the door shut before turning to me, her voice careful, almost too light. "Dad's gone a lot lately." I forced a smile and told her he was just busy. The kind of busy that paid for college and vacations. But the words tasted thin even as I said them. She nodded slowly, unconvinced, and carried her books upstairs, leaving me with the heavy truth that children often sense what parents are too afraid to say aloud. By the end of the week, the photo in my clutch was no longer just a suspicion, it had become a prophecy. I found myself replaying the scene in the lobby, the perfume, the laughter, the hand on his arm. It wasn't only what I had seen, but what I had felt, the hollow space opening in me where trust used to live. And though part of me wanted to confront him, to demand explanations he'd likely rehearse and deflect, another part of me knew the truth would speak louder if I let it reveal itself. Waiting wasn't weakness anymore. It was strategy. The following Saturday, I heard his phone buzz against the counter while he stepped out to the garage. The name on the screen was tucked under a harmless alias, Thomas, but the message glowed sharp as a blade. Dinner was perfect. Same time next week. My stomach tightened as I read it, the perfume in my memory growing stronger. No longer imagined, but confirmed in letters I hadn't written. I set the phone down exactly as it had been and returned to the living room before he came back inside, my face calm, though my chest thundered with the sound of betrayal finally showing its hand. I went to bed that night beside a man who carried secrets in his pocket. Secrets that had already begun to fray the life we had built. His breathing evened into sleep, while my eyes traced the ceiling, replaying every moment that now looked different under the harsh light of suspicion. The perfume, the photo, the jacket, the text, each one a crack, each one a whisper of a truth I could no longer deny. And as I lay there in the dark, a thought settled over me with the weight of finality. Whatever this was becoming, it was no longer mine alone to repair. When morning came, the sunlight felt colder, slipping through the blinds with an edge I hadn't noticed before. Mark sat at the table sipping his coffee, his phone face down beside him, as if even he didn't want to look at the story he'd begun to write. He smiled briefly, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, brittle and practiced. I poured myself a cup, hands steady despite the storm inside, and met his gaze with a quiet strength I hadn't drawn on in years. I didn't say a word, not yet. Because the cracks had only begun to show, and I needed him to keep writing the truth until there was no way left for him to erase it. And in that silence, I understood something I hadn't before, that the most dangerous lies aren't shouted. They're whispered through the details. And the details, piece by piece, were about to tell me everything I needed to know. The mornings began to feel longer than the days themselves. I would rise before dawn, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, listening to the quiet tick of the clock, while the house held its breath. Mark's absence on those early mornings had become a rhythm of its own, the sound of the garage door opening before the sun came up, his car fading down the street while the rest of us still slept. He called them early meetings, but the excuse carried the same hollowness as the perfume on his jacket. I would linger there, in the stillness, watching the pale light grow across the yard, wondering how long I could keep silence folded around me like a second skin. At school, I found myself speaking gently to students, even when I felt brittle inside. They came into my office with problems that were heavy for them, but small compared to the weight I carried in secret. I nodded, gave advice, reminded them that life had seasons, yet in my own life, I felt as though the season had shifted without my consent. By the time the final bell rang, I dreaded the drive home, not for what I might find there, but for what I already knew I wouldn't. The laughter that used to greet me was gone, replaced by the echo of my keys dropping on the counter instead, and the sound of Lily upstairs humming faintly as she worked on assignments. One evening, I lingered by her doorway longer than usual. She was bent over her desk hair spilling across her shoulder, the glow of her laptop painting her face. She turned suddenly and caught me watching. "Mom, is Dad okay?" she asked, her voice cautious. I managed a small smile and stepped into the room, smoothing her hair as if she were still a little girl. "He's just busy," I said, though the words tasted bitter even as I spoke them. Her eyes studied mine sharper than I expected, and she didn't press further. But the silence she left behind pressed against me harder than any accusation could. Nights in our bedroom became their own kind of trial. Mark would slip beneath the covers after midnight, moving carefully as though he didn't want to disturb me, though I was never asleep. I would lie still, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of messages arriving on his phone before he silenced it. Sometimes I caught the faintest smile tugging at his mouth in the dim light, a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. I would turn toward the wall, holding my breath until the ache in my chest eased enough to let sleep take me. The turning point arrived on a Thursday when I came home to find the dining table set with only one plate. Mark had left a note scrawled on the back of an envelope, "Late dinner with clients, don't wait up." I crumpled it in my fist and dropped it into the trash, then stood at the counter, staring at the empty chair across from mine. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat alone, the fork scraping across the plate, louder than it should have been. By the time I finished, tears blurred the edges of the room, but I refused to let them fall. Crying felt like giving him permission, and I had already given enough. Later that night, I heard his car pull into the driveway. I stayed at the window, the curtain drawn back just enough to watch. He sat in the car longer than usual, head bent toward his phone, the glow of the screen lighting his face. When he finally came inside, his smile was faint, but rehearsed. "Long night," he said again, loosening his tie. I nodded without answering and walked upstairs, my silence louder than any question I could have asked. In the mirror of our bathroom, I studied my reflection. My eyes looked older, my mouth too tight, but beneath the weariness was something else, a flicker of resolve I hadn't seen before. The loneliness sharpened over the weekend. Mark claimed another business trip, leaving before breakfast on Saturday. Lily spent the afternoon with friends, the house emptier than ever. I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, watching the autumn leaves drift down the street. Each gust of wind seemed to carry away another memory, another piece of what I thought had been solid. I closed my eyes, listening to the rustle of branches, and admitted the truth I had resisted for weeks. I wasn't imagining the cracks. They were real, and I was the only one willing to face them. Sunday evening, Mark returned with a bouquet of lilies in hand, the kind of gesture he hadn't made in years. He placed them on the counter, kissed my cheek, and told me he'd missed us. I smiled faintly, but inside, I wondered who had reminded him flowers could make amends. Lily ran down the stairs, delighted by the blooms, her joy a sharp contrast to the hollowness I felt. Watching them together, I realized how much of my pain was hidden behind her innocence, how carefully I had been guarding her from the truth. And yet, even as I stood there, I knew the guardrails wouldn't hold much longer. That night, I lay awake listening to his steady breathing. The bouquet sat in a vase on the dresser, filling the room with a sweetness that felt more like apology than affection. I turned toward the window, tracing the outline of the trees against the night sky, and let the tears come at last. They weren't loud, and they weren't for him. They were for me, for the woman who had given years of loyalty, only to find herself standing in shadows, holding on to the edges of a life that was quietly slipping away. The days that followed were quieter still. I moved through them with a calm face, but inside, I was unraveling one thread at a time. The evidence was there, stacked like stones, the perfume, the photo, the secret messages, the late-night returns. And though I had not confronted him yet, the weight of silence was becoming too heavy to bear. I could feel the shift in myself, the moment where sorrow begins to harden into something sharper, where pain becomes clarity. I wasn't there yet, but I could feel it coming steady as a tide. And when it came, I knew I wouldn't be the same woman anymore. The bouquet of lilies withered faster than I expected, their petals curling inward, as if they'd grown tired of pretending. I left them on the dresser anyway, a quiet reminder of the hollowness beneath Mark's sudden gestures. Each morning, I passed them on my way to the closet, their scent fading until all that remained was the memory of how quickly beauty can spoil. I thought of how many times I had watered things between us that were already gone, hoping care alone could keep them alive. By the middle of the week, I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had shifted. The heaviness in my chest had begun to sharpen into clarity. I caught myself studying him differently, not as a husband who might return to me, but as a man already gone, leaving only the weight of appearances behind. It was painful, yes, but in the quiet hours after he left for work, I felt my breath steady in ways it hadn't for weeks. The tears that once came so easily no longer fell. I had cried myself dry, and what replaced it was a steadiness I didn't yet know how to name. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook in front of me, the lined pages still empty. I wasn't ready to write down the details, not yet, but I needed to see the possibility of it my own story, not his version. Lily walked in with her backpack slung over her shoulder, setting it on the chair beside me. "Mom," she said quietly, "you seem different." I smiled, gently closing the notebook. "Sometimes, being different is the first step to being stronger," I told her. She nodded, though I could see the worry flicker in her eyes before she disappeared upstairs. Mark came home later that night with his phone pressed to his ear, laughing in a tone I hadn't heard in months. He gestured a wave toward me as he walked past, mouthing the words, "Just a client." But his laughter carried an intimacy that no client had earned, and the perfume trailing faintly from his coat told the rest of the story. For the first time, I didn't feel my stomach twist with despair. Instead, a calm spread through me, like standing on solid ground after weeks of stumbling. I no longer needed to ask questions he would only answer with lies. I already knew. The following weekend, I drove Lily to her friend's house for a sleepover. As we pulled into the driveway, she squeezed my hand before climbing out of the car. "Don't stay up too late worrying," she said with a smile that was far too wise for her age. I promised I wouldn't, and for once, I intended to keep it. On the way home, I rolled down the window, letting the cool night air wash across my face. The world outside felt wider than it had in weeks, as if my silence had been cracked open by something stronger than grief. When I returned, Mark's car wasn't in the driveway. I sat for a long moment in the quiet before stepping inside. The house felt too big for just me, but it also carried a strange peace I hadn't felt in months. I walked from room to room, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the counter, the cool glass of the picture frames, as if reclaiming what still belonged to me. Upstairs, I poured the wilted lilies into the trash, the petals scattering like the end of a season. For the first time, I didn't feel the loss. I felt the release. The next morning, Mark returned earlier than usual, his shirt untucked, his hair askew, in a way that told me more than he ever could. He leaned against the counter, rubbing the back of his neck, searching my face for something I no longer offered. "Rough night," he muttered, as if the words might excuse his absence. I nodded once, nothing more, and turned back to the sink. He waited for me to ask to pry, but when I didn't, he grew restless. "You don't have anything to say?" he asked, finally, his voice edged with disbelief. I met his eyes briefly and answered softly, "Not anymore." The silence that followed unsettled him more than any argument could have. He shifted his weight, drummed his fingers against the counter, and finally left the room, muttering under his breath. I listened to his footsteps retreat upstairs, then exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. In that moment, I understood the power of not giving him what he expected. He wanted resistance, wanted me to beg or accuse, but I had nothing left to give. My silence had become my strength, and it left him standing alone in the space he had created. That night, I sat outside on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, the autumn air crisp against my skin. I thought about the years I had spent believing loyalty was enough, that if I simply held on, the cracks would seal themselves. But now, I saw it differently. Love without respect was only dependency disguised as devotion, and I had lived too long in that disguise. The stars above shimmered faintly, and for the first time in months, I let myself imagine a future where I wasn't walking behind him, waiting to be chosen. A future where I chose myself. When I went back inside, The house was dark except for the faint glow from under our bedroom door. I paused at the threshold, hearing the soft tap of keys on his phone, the quiet murmur of his laughter. I didn't push the door open. Instead, I turned away, carrying my blanket with me to the guest room down the hall. The sheets smelled of lavender detergent untouched by the shadows of betrayal, and as I slipped between them, I felt a strange kind of peace. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was the first step toward reclaiming myself. And as I closed my eyes, I knew this silence would not last forever. The truth had already begun to carve its way out, and soon it would no longer be something I carried alone. The guest room became my sanctuary, a place untouched by the weight of his betrayal. Each night, I carried my blanket down the hall, and each morning, I folded it neatly at the foot of the bed, a ritual that steadied me. Mark asked once why I wasn't in our room, his tone half annoyed and half anxious. I told him I needed better sleep, that the lavender scent on the sheets helped me rest. He didn't push further, though his eyes searched mine, as if he could sense the wall I had begun to build. I started spending more time outside the house. Small things, at first running errands alone, staying later at school, visiting my father-in-law Walter under the guise of checking on him. Walter welcomed me with open arms, grateful for the company since his knees kept him from getting around much. Over cups of black coffee, he shared stories of his contracting days, about how a house was only as strong as its foundation. I listened carefully, not just to his tales, but to the lesson beneath them. My own foundation had cracked, but I wasn't going to let the whole structure collapse. One evening, I found myself sitting in his garage, the scent of sawdust still lingering from projects long finished. Walter leaned back in his chair and looked at me steadily. "Something's on your mind, Elena. You don't have to say it, but I see it." My throat tightened, but I managed a faint smile. "I'm learning that sometimes silence is louder than words." He nodded as if he understood more than I had confessed. That small exchange reminded me that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it waited patiently, choosing its moment. At home, Mark seemed to sense the shift. He grew restless, pacing the kitchen more often, picking at small details, like an unbalanced picture frame or the way the mail was stacked. When I didn't rise to his irritation, his voice sharpened. "You don't even care anymore, do you?" he asked one night, slamming his keys on the counter. I met his eyes and answered softly, "I care about what's worth caring for." The words slipped out calmer than I expected, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He stormed upstairs, leaving me with the sound of his footsteps pounding out a rhythm I refused to follow. In the days that followed, I began taking quiet steps toward reclaiming myself. I opened a separate bank account, depositing small portions of my paycheck that Mark would never notice missing. I gathered important papers, birth certificates, our mortgage insurance documents, and stored copies in a folder at school. Each action was small, but together they felt like bricks building something sturdy beneath my feet. I didn't announce these changes, and I didn't need to. They were mine alone, the first quiet steps toward freedom. I also reached out to an old friend from college, Margaret Collins, a lawyer who now worked in family law. She was a few years older than me, sharp but kind, with the sort of voice that calmed even the stormiest rooms. We met for coffee under the guise of catching up, but when she asked how things were, my answer spilled out in fragments. Margaret listened without judgment, her eyes steady on mine. "Elena," she said gently, "you don't have to decide everything today. Just know that you have options, and I'll stand by you if you ever need me." Her words settled into me like a seed waiting to grow. At school, I noticed how different I felt moving through the halls. The weight that once bent my shoulders had lifted, if only slightly, and even the students sensed it. One of them, a shy girl named Claire, lingered after our session one afternoon. "You seem stronger this week," she said quietly. I smiled at her, touched by her perception. Sometimes strength comes from realizing what you can't change, I told her. She nodded slowly, as if tucking the lesson into her own pocket. The weekend brought another test. Mark announced he had to attend a conference 2 towns over and would be gone overnight. He delivered the news, casually pouring himself a drink as if he were discussing the weather. I simply nodded, offering no protest, no question. His eyes flickered with confusion, unsettled by my composure. When he left with his suitcase the next morning, I waited until the sound of his car disappeared. Then, sat at the kitchen table with my notebook. This time, I began to write not just thoughts, but plans, lists, and truths I could no longer ignore. The pen moved steadily across the page, outlining steps toward a life not tethered to his betrayals. That night alone in the quiet house, I cooked dinner for Lily and me. We laughed over burnt garlic bread, her chatter filling the spaces his absence used to claim. After she went upstairs, I lingered at the table, staring at the flicker of a candle I had lit out of habit. The flame wavered, but it didn't go out, and neither would I. When Mark returned the next day, he wore the same suit jacket he had left in, though the wrinkle across the shoulder suggested it had been tossed on a chair rather than hung. He greeted me with forced cheer, describing the conference in vague terms. I listened without comment, nodding at the right places, offering no challenge to his story. He seemed almost disappointed, as if my silence robbed him of the performance he had prepared. Later that night, as he scrolled through his phone, I caught the faintest shadow of worry cross his face. He was beginning to sense it. The distance between us was no longer just emotional. It was deliberate. I knew then that I had turned a corner. The pain was still there, but it had changed shape, no longer heavy enough to crush me. My tears had dried into resolve, and my silence had become a shield he couldn't penetrate. The cracks in our marriage were no longer secrets I carried alone. They were the evidence of who he truly was. And quietly, carefully, I was preparing for the day those cracks would split wide open. And when that day came, I wouldn't be the one caught off balance. The calm I had built around myself didn't last long. By the following week, whispers began to reach me from places I hadn't expected: neighbors, coworkers, even a parent at school who pulled me aside with an uneasy expression. "I hope everything's all right at home," she said gently, though her eyes told me she'd already heard something. I thanked her for her concern, my smile steady, though my stomach twisted. The rumors had started, and I didn't need to ask where they came from. Mark had begun his campaign. It started subtly, little hints that I was distracted at work, that I'd grown cold, that maybe I wasn't as steady as people thought. I caught a colleague watching me with careful eyes during a staff meeting, his kindness laced with quiet pity. Later that afternoon, my principal stopped by my office asking if everything was okay at home. I answered calmly, assuring him my family life was private but stable, though I knew the damage was already spreading. Mark had found a way to turn my silence into his weapon. At home, his tone shifted. He no longer stormed or argued. Instead, he played the part of the wounded husband, sighing heavily at the dinner table, speaking in half-sentences that suggested I had abandoned him long before he strayed. When Lily asked why he was so quiet, he shook his head as if the answer was too painful to speak. "Sometimes people change," he murmured, glancing at me in a way that made her eyes flicker with confusion. He was rewriting the story not with rage, but with suggestion, leaving me to carry the weight of his lies. I knew then that silence could no longer be my only weapon. Quiet had given me strength, but now it was time for the truth to breathe. I began gathering the fragments I'd tucked away: copies of his late-night messages, the receipt for a hotel stay that had never been part of any conference, and the anonymous email I had traced back to his account. Each piece of evidence told the same story, and together they formed a portrait he could no longer deny. I didn't confront him in private. I chose my moment, carefully waiting until the evening of a small family gathering at Walter's house. It was meant to be a simple dinner, just us and Walter, who had asked for more time together now that his health kept him close to home. Mark arrived late, blaming traffic, though the faint perfume on his jacket said otherwise. We sat around the table, the conversation light at first, Walter telling stories from his younger days, while Lily laughed at his exaggerations. Mark kept his eyes on his plate, answering only when prompted. When the meal was nearly finished, I set my fork down and folded my hands in front of me. "There's something I need to say." I began, my voice calm, though my heart pounded. Mark looked up sharply, suspicion flashing in his eyes. Walter leaned back, his expression steady but attentive. Lily grew quiet, sensing the change in the air. I pulled the small folder from my bag and placed it on the table. "I've kept these for weeks, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to." "Mark, it's time the truth is seen." He stiffened, his hand tightening around his glass. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. I opened the folder, sliding the papers and photographs across the table. "These are your messages, your hotel receipt, the emails you sent under someone else's name. You've tried to paint me as unstable, but this is who you are." Lily's eyes widened, her hand frozen halfway to her glass. Walter glanced down at the documents, his jaw tightening as he skimmed the evidence. Mark pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he snapped through, his voice trembled. "You've twisted everything, Elena. You're trying to destroy me." I met his gaze evenly, my voice steady. "No, Mark. You've done that to yourself. I'm simply refusing to carry the blame for it any longer." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, Walter spoke, his voice firm but tired. "Son, I've seen many things in my life, but I've never seen a man save his marriage by lying to the people who love him. You can't keep hiding behind her silence." His words cut deeper than mine ever could. Mark's face crumpled, anger and shame warring across his expression, but he said nothing more. Lily excused herself quietly, retreating upstairs, her footsteps heavy on the stairs. I wanted to go after her to shield her from the weight of what she had just learned, but I knew she needed space to process. Walter reached across the table and placed his weathered hand over mine. "You've carried this too long," he said softly. "It's not your burden anymore." Mark stood abruptly, grabbing his coat from the back of his chair. "You'll regret this," he muttered, though the threat sounded hollow. He left without looking back, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the frames on the wall. The silence that followed was thick, but for the first time in months, it wasn't suffocating. It was release. I sat there for a while, staring at the folder still open on the table, the truth finally laid bare. Walter gave my hand a gentle squeeze before rising slowly from his chair. "You've done what needed to be done," he said. "Now let him deal with the ruin he made." His words settled in my chest like a steadying weight. That night, as I drove home with Lily quiet in the passenger seat, I felt the shift inside me. The secret was no longer mine alone to bear, and the power of his lies had crumbled under the weight of truth. He could spread rumors, he could twist stories, but the evidence was out now. His mask had cracked, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the rest of his world began to collapse. And as I pulled into the driveway, I realized something even more important for the first time. I wasn't afraid of what came next. The days after the dinner at Walter's house moved with a strange stillness, like the pause between thunder and rain. Mark stayed away for nights at a time, his excuses growing shorter and less convincing. I no longer asked where he had been, and the absence of my questions seemed to unnerve him more than any confrontation could have. He was waiting for me to break, to scream, to chase after him. Instead, I carried myself through each day with a steadiness that left him grasping for control he no longer had. At school, the rumors he had planted began to lose their edge. The documents I'd shared with my lawyer, Margaret, had been quietly filed in the right places, and the people who mattered most now knew the truth. My principal, who had once looked at me with wary concern, stopped by one afternoon with a softer expression.
"You don't need to explain anything,
"Elena," he said.
"We stand behind you."
His words were a quiet balm proof that Mark's story was crumbling. He had underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect myself. Walter called, often checking in not just on me, but on Lily, whose silence had grown heavier since that night. One Saturday, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands curled around a mug of cocoa. "Mom," she said hesitantly, "does Dad even want to be here anymore?" The question cut deeper than any of Mark's betrayals. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "I don't know what he wants," I answered honestly, "but I do know we deserve better than waiting for him to figure it out." She nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. She blinked away. The shift came a week later at a charity event hosted by Tessa. I hadn't planned to attend, but Walter encouraged me to go, insisting that shrinking back would only give Mark more power. So I put on a navy dress that had been gathering dust in the closet, smoothed my hair, and walked into the hall with my head high. The room glittered with lights and chatter, and almost immediately I felt eyes turn toward me. Whispers traveled quickly, but I met each glance with calm composure, refusing to carry shame that was not mine. Mark arrived late, just as the speeches began. Tessa stood near the front greeting guests with her usual bright smile, but when she saw me, her expression faltered for a moment. She recovered quickly, turning her attention back to her guests, though the stiffness in her shoulders betrayed her. Mark joined her side, his hand brushing hers as naturally as if I weren't standing just across the room. Conversation slowed, and I could feel the air tighten with anticipation. I didn't cause a scene. Instead, I waited until the evening reached its height when the music softened and people began to gather near the stage for the auction. That was when Margaret appeared at my side, her presence calm and deliberate. She carried a small folder under her arm, much like the one I had laid on Walter's table. "Are you ready?" she whispered. I nodded, the decision already firm in my chest. When the bidding began, Margaret stepped forward, requesting the microphone for a brief announcement on behalf of a donor. The room quieted, expecting another pledge of support. Instead, she spoke clearly, her words measured and steady. "Before we proceed, there are matters of truth that need light. We cannot celebrate generosity in this room while deceit runs unchecked." She opened the folder, holding up copies of Mark's messages, the receipts, the evidence that tied him to lies he had spun so carefully. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, sharp and unmistakable. Mark surged forward, his voice raised. "This is slander," he shouted, but the tremor in his tone betrayed him. Margaret remained composed, reminding him that these were his own words, his own actions. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The room had already turned. Tessa tried to step back, her hand slipping from his arm, but eyes followed her too, whispers latching onto her name with equal weight. I stood near the back, my hands folded in front of me, breathing evenly as the truth spilled into the open. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. Then slowly, people began to turn away from him. Conversations resumed, but not with him. No one reached for his hand or offered him comfort. He stood in the center of the room, exposed and diminished, while I remained steady, watching the life he had built on lies unravel in plain sight. When I left that evening, Walter was waiting outside with the car. He looked at me as I slid into the seat, his eyes filled with quiet pride. "You didn't have to say a word," he said. The truth spoke for itself. I nodded, the weight of the evening settling into me like a deep exhale. For once, I hadn't been the one humiliated. He had. The following days carried their own echoes. Word spread quickly through town, and Mark's professional circle grew quiet around him. Clients pulled back, colleagues avoided his calls, and even neighbors who once waved from across the street turned away. He tried to reach me, leaving messages filled with anger one moment and pleas the next, but I no longer answered. My silence was no longer a shield. It was final. And yet, even as I watched his world collapse, I knew the story wasn't finished. The damage he had caused had rippled through every corner of my life, touching Lily, testing Walter, staining my name in places where whispers still lingered. Justice had begun, but it was not yet complete. As I stood in the quiet of my kitchen one evening, watching Lily stir a pot of soup with a steadiness beyond her years, I realized the final step was still ahead of me. The truth had been exposed, but dignity, the kind that cannot be taken away, was waiting to be reclaimed. And I knew deep down that moment was coming soon. The silence in the days that followed felt different than before. It wasn't the heavy quiet of suspicion or the aching pause of loneliness. This time, it was clean, a space where I could finally breathe without waiting for the next blow. Mark's absence lingered like an echo, but it no longer hollowed out the rooms. It simply faded the way a storm fades after it has already broken every branch it could reach. Lily adjusted in her own way. For a while, she watched me carefully as if waiting for me to crumble, but slowly she began to relax. I noticed it in her laughter, in the way she hummed again when she cooked beside me, in the lightness that returned to her voice when she spoke about college plans. One evening, she asked quietly, "Mom, are we really going to be okay?" I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Yes," I told her with certainty. "We already are." And in that moment, I realized how much of my strength had been borrowed from her, and how much I owed her the truth of resilience. Walter remained steady through it all, calling to check in, stopping by with bags of groceries, even when I insisted I had plenty. His quiet support filled the spaces Mark had left behind, reminding me that family is sometimes defined not by perfection, but by presence. When he clasped my hand and said, "You've done right by yourself," Elena, I believed him. His pride mattered not because I needed approval, but because he saw me clearly, something Mark had stopped doing long ago. The town adjusted too. Whispers that once carried suspicion began to shift, people approaching me with gentle words instead of wary glances. Margaret's careful work ensured that the truth was more than gossip. It was documented, undeniable. Mark's reputation sank beneath the weight of his own choices. Contracts fell through, invitations dwindled, and those who once welcomed his company kept their distance. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Watching him unravel was never about revenge. It was about finally laying down what he had tried to make me carry. At home, I began to rebuild in quiet ways. I painted the guest room a soft shade of blue, turning it into a reading space just for me. I cleared the closet of clothes that no longer felt like mine, donating them without regret. Even the smallest acts, new curtains, a different brand of coffee, a vase of fresh flowers on the table, became reminders that I could shape this life again, not as a reaction to him, but as a reflection of myself. One Sunday evening, as Lily and I sat with bowls of soup and bread fresh from the oven, I realized the house no longer felt haunted. The weight of betrayal had been replaced by the comfort of routine. But this time, the routine was ours alone. No performance, no pretending, just a mother and daughter sharing warmth at the end of the day. I felt gratitude then, not for what I had endured, but for what had survived in spite of it. Looking back, I see that betrayal is not only about losing trust in another person, it is about losing sight of yourself. For too long, I believed silence would keep me safe, but in the end, it was truth and steady resolve that set me free. Mark built his life on lies, and in doing so, he lost more than a marriage. He lost respect, trust, and the very people who once stood by his side. I walked away with something he could never touch: my dignity. If there is any lesson I carry from this, it is that quiet strength does not mean accepting less than you deserve. It means waiting until you can step forward with clarity, until you can hold your head high without apology. Justice doesn't always look like thunder or fire. Sometimes it is as simple as choosing peace while the storm rages behind you. And tonight, as I sit with this chapter finally closed, I know that peace is the truest form of freedom. It is the laughter of my daughter, the steady presence of those who never wavered, the calm of a home that belongs to me again. Before we close, I'd love to know which part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.